If you've ever thought to yourself, I really wish Maserati or Ferrari would make an SUV, well, you're in luck because we have the 2019 Maserati Levante right here with a Ferrari engine under the hood and, of course, all the styling that you've come to know and love out of Maserati for some time. This is definitely a very distinctive vehicle. It was originally launched in 2017, but for 2019, it's been refreshed to help sharpen things up a little bit and fix some of the complaints that shoppers had about the original 2017 and 2018 model year vehicles. This starts at about $76,000 or so, so this is not exactly a direct competitor to something like a Mercedes-Benz GLE, although you could obviously compare it to that model. It's instead directed more at something like the Porsche Cayenne. Depending on your options, you could get this up well over the price tag of the GLE, just in case you're wondering. The era of Maserati being a little bit behind the times when it comes to gadgets and electronics definitely seems to be at an end. The Levante has full LED headlamps. Matrix headlamps are available, but sadly, America's headlamp laws are behind the times, so you'll only be able to get that next level in lighting technology if you live in Europe. We also have fog lamps down below, a very large and aggressive Maserati grille right here. It's so large and so open that you can actually just reach in and grab the active grille shutters right back there. Those help improve efficiency by helping air move around the front when it's not needed to cool the engine. We have a very large Maserati logo right there. It's a trident design. We have a 360-degree camera above it, and behind the logo we have a radar adaptive cruise control sensor because this has radar adaptive cruise control and very aggressive lane keeping assistance for semi-autonomous highway driving. At the bottom we have some well-integrated parking sensors. From the side profile, it's pretty easy to see that the Levante is a large crossover for this particular segment. This is about 8 inches longer than a Mercedes-Benz GLE. It's very noticeable on the inside and in the cargo area right back here. And it's still several inches longer than the Porsche Cayenne, even though that is longer than the Mercedes as well. We have some Maserati badging right over here on the side, and this has a full adaptive air suspension, so it can raise and lower the vehicle, can also adjust the damping of the vehicle. In case you're wondering, these little vent ports on the side are functional, and they don't have anything to do with the number of cylinders under the hood like some of the Buicks in the past, so even though this is a V8, we still have 3 on each side. The rear end is styled very much like the rest of the Maserati family. We have these LED accent strips that run through the headlamp module, and it is split between the hatch and the body of the vehicle. If I lift up the hatch, you'll notice that it is relatively slanted forward. That does cut down on cargo practicality in the back, but because this is such a large vehicle, it actually does fairly well for itself in this very small segment. At the bottom of the bumper, we have quad exhaust tips. These really are quite large, and then we have well-integrated parking sensors out back. Under the hood, we find 2 different engines and 4 different power levels. Things start out with a 345 horsepower turbocharged V6 engine, produces 369 pound-feet of torque, or you can get the next trim level up, which would give you 424 horsepower from basically the same engine. We then have this V8 right here, which is a Ferrari Maserati 3.8-liter V8 engine, twin turbo as well, produces 550 horsepower and 538 pound-feet of torque in the GTS trim, which is what we're driving right here. But if you upgrade to the Trofeo, which is considerably more expensive, you will get 590 horsepower. Bearing in mind that the trim that we're driving today is the GTS trim, and this started at $119,980, I am a little bit disappointed in the driver's seat. This seat offers less motion than we find in the competition. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, extending pedals, which are done by a button right there under the seat front, and then we have a power tilt telescopic steering column, but we don't have adjustable side bolsters, power extending thigh cushions, adjustable seat back contours, and the headrests are just 2-way adjustable designs. Although I found these seats to be fairly comfortable for my body shape, I do wish that you sunk into them a little bit more. It feels kind of like I'm sitting on the seat rather than in the seat, and again, you will find a great deal more adjustability in some of those other competitors at around $120,000 or so. The wheelbase in the Levante is a little bit longer than the GLE or the Cayenne, so we do find a relatively spacious rear end back here, although I wish we had even more legroom because a vehicle this expensive that's already this big on the outside, I had expected to find just a little bit more interior room. Headroom is fairly generous. If I sit back here in the rear seats, I have about 1 inch of headroom left, and sitting right there behind myself, I have about 4.5 inches of legroom. If I move on over to the right side of the vehicle, where the front seat was all the way back in its tracks, I can just barely move my feet back there, and my legs are just barely not touching the seat. I have perhaps 1/2 inch of legroom left there, although I could still do this fairly comfortably for a long period of time. If I move over to the middle seat, my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling, but if I lean back in the seat, It's actually a relatively generous amount of space. Unlike many luxury SUVs from Europe, we don't have a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. However, we do have a ski pass-through right there on the 60% side. Now, these seats also recline a little bit. That is the most upright position. And then we have a slightly more reclined position. This is really more to square off the cargo area than actually to improve rear passenger comfort. On the rear windows, we have power window shades in the model that we're driving. They zip right down there into the door very neatly. Behind this hatch, we find just over 19 cubic feet of cargo space. That is on the small side when compared against the Mercedes or the Porsche, but it's worth noting that companies often measure cargo area a little bit differently from one another, so that may be part of what's going on here. However, the rest of what's going on here really has to be the way this overall hatch is shaped. You can see that it has this very drastic bent forward, and that does mean that the cargo area is going to be a little bit smaller than something with a more vertical rear end in the back. 22-inch roller bags fit back here fairly easy. I suspect 24-inch roller bags would as well. This cargo cover is a hard cargo cover. That blocks sound a bit more than a roller cover, but it does mean that if you wanted to take this out of the vehicle and put larger cargo back here, it would be difficult to store somewhere. You'd have to find some place to put that. Under this cargo area load floor, we don't really have a space for that to go. We do find a little bit of additional storage, a very compact inflatable spare tire, and then the latter part of that cargo area is entirely taken up by a subwoofer. If that had been a little bit more compact, we would have had more storage room. On the inside, we find controls that are very similar to the Maserati Quattroporte. We have a suede headliner in this particular model, and a very large moonroof that goes all the way over there to just over the rear passengers' heads. Because of the overall size of the Levante, it doesn't go quite as far back as it would in other vehicles that would be a little bit smaller. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and two-way adjustable headrests. These seats are both heated and ventilated. That's why we have perforated leather sections in the middle. Bolstering on the seat back and seat bottom cushion is fairly aggressive, but because the seat bottom cushion doesn't let you sink in terribly far, and the fact that the seats are fairly wide, I didn't really find myself noticing those bolsters very much. You still slide around a little bit on the seat. If we move over to the door, we find one of the things that Maserati is incredibly good at, and that is interior attention to detail and overall interior design. We have a very attractive front door panel right here, that door handle that integrates very nicely with the trim piece, wood trim, a lot of stitched materials going on. This entire door panel is full of stitched leather, and that wraps around all the way to the parts that you can't actually see, including that armrest. Even the bottom portion of the doors is covered in stitched leather, except for that inside of the bottle holder that is a different plastic. The heavy concentration of leather continues on the dashboard, where we find a stitched upper section of the dashboard, as well as a stitched lower section of the dashboard. So the ivory section there at the bottom of your screen, including that glove box cover, that's leather as well, and the seams are very, very well done. This is actually one of the better interiors that I've seen in terms of attention to detail and quality on the stitching. In the center of the dashboard, we find a center channel speaker and two air vents. These are actually knobs right here to open and close air vents that give you a little bit more of a diffuse volume of air right about your face level. We have an analog clock right here, and then we have an 8.4-inch color infotainment screen. The infotainment system is basically a Maserati version of the Uconnect system that we see in other FCA vehicles. However, a lot has been said about this particular system in a negative way, but I actually really like the fact that Maserati used Uconnect, because this system is fast, it's easy to use, all the features and functions were already there built into this system, so it didn't really take a lot of design effort for them to include them in the vehicle. And that's something that low volume manufacturers like Jaguar or Aston Martin really have troubles with. And Maserati didn't have that problem because they were able to pull from a different division of the same company, borrow those technologies that worked well, and integrate them right here into the dashboard. So we find touch controls for things like the ventilated seats, heated seats. This is where you would adjust the way certain vehicle active safety systems work. We have full Android Auto and Apple CarPlay capability. The system is very snappy. It also offers that surround camera view. We have an app manager, so you can download additional apps right here to the system, built-in factory navigation with traffic information. Admittedly, the mapping software is not as snazzy as we find in Audi's MMI system or perhaps BMW's iDrive, but this is arguably better than most other small volume luxury manufacturers. We also have full access to the Sirius XM suite of travel link services like weather maps, fuel prices, movie listings, etc. One thing, however, that is missing from this system, unfortunately, is we don't find the OnStar-like telematics service that we do see in some of the other FCA implementations of basically the same infotainment software. Moving down below that screen, we find the controls for the 2 zones up front in the climate control system. There are an additional 2 zones in the rear. You'd actually control those via this touchscreen infotainment system. So if I went back here to the home screen and then went back to the main, hit climate right there, you can put those options on that shortcut bar at the bottom. We can then go to the rear zone and then adjust that rear climate control zone. Below the climate controls, we have a storage area where we have a single USB input, auxiliary input, SD card slot, and just about enough room to hide an iPhone 7 Plus right like that. Tuck the cord in and actually close this compartment if you really worked at that with the cable. Behind that, we have the new shifter design, which is a big change for 2019. This is now a joystick-style toggle shifter, very much like we find in BMW models. There's a button on the back. We pull that, toggle once back for drive, once forward for reverse. And neutral is found by toggling once backward from reverse, or if we're in drive, once forward. You could then get reverse by clicking that button on the back and then toggling forward again. If you're in the drive mode, you can toggle over to the left and then push away from the driver for gear down, pull towards the driver for gear up. Park is achieved by that button right there on the top of the shifter. To the left of the shifter, we have a row of buttons where we can turn on and off our traction control and stability control, engage off-road mode, the advanced efficiency mode, sport mode, and then adjust the way the suspension behaves in this vehicle. There are 2 different modes, sport on or sport off. Then to the right of that, we have an interesting little controller. It seems like luxury car companies feel the need to have some sort of rotary knob contraption in order to control the infotainment system. Personally, I prefer the touchscreen that we have in this model, but if you wanted to interact with it using these knobs, this would be the volume knob right here on top. This is the navigation knob. You click down in the center. This pulls up a favorites menu, and then we have a back button that is contextual. Behind that, we have the hazard light button, electric parking brake button, and a button to raise and lower the adaptive air suspension. On the right side of that, we have an eccentrically opening lid, which reveals 2 fairly decently sized cup holders and a 12-volt power port right in the middle. Between the front seats, we find a padded center armrest that opens to reveal a very shallow storage compartment. You can see this is not removable. It's actually the bottom right there. This is what the key looks like. It mirrors the shapes that we have going on the steering wheel. It's a pretty large and pretty heavy key. That's the only downside. I think it's attractive. It feels good. I love the logo on the back, but it is very heavy. So if you don't like heavy keys, that may be a problem for some of you. The reason this compartment is so shallow is because we have the 4-zone climate control system. The controls are right there on the back of it, and a lot of that plumbing and ducting has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is right there where a storage compartment would go. And then we have a color multifunction display between the speedometer and tachometer that gives us the additional gauge readouts that you see on your screen right there, fuel level and engine temperature. We also get the status of driver assistance systems, fuel economy screens, our trip computer information, status of the start-stop system, etc., audio system information. Vehicle settings is where you would adjust things, interestingly, including the dimmer in this vehicle rather than using a traditional dimmer knob. There's also a digital speedometer, tire pressure monitoring, etc. The steering wheel is basically the same one that we find in the Quattroporte. We have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system over here on the left side, as well as our lane keeping system right there. This has a slightly more aggressive lane keeping system than is common in the luxury segment. Hill descent control button right there. Buttons to control that multifunction LCD on this side, along with the voice command button and phone button. You won't find volume up, down, or track forward, backward on the front of the steering wheel because, like many FCA vehicles, those are actually on the back of the steering wheel. That helps reduce driver distraction. It actually is a feature that I really like. We have track up, down on the left over here, volume up, down over there on the right, as well as mode. On the back of the steering wheel, we have paddle shifters. These are magnesium paddles, and they are attached to the steering column, so they don't move with the steering wheel. We have down on the left and up over there on the right. In our 0 to 60 testing, this model ran 4.5 seconds 0 to 60. Keep in mind that we are not at home. We are up here in Oregon. We're at about 1,200, 1,300 feet or so, and I have my camera guy in the car. So all that together means that it is likely going to be about 0.3 of a second faster at home. You will, of course, have to wait until we can get this on our own home turf and test this at sea level to see if it can match the manufacturer's claim of 4 seconds flat. I suspect it may be possible, but initially I'm just going to say that this is probably going to be around the 4.2 second 0 to 60 range. We don't have official braking distances yet, but you should expect this to be longer than something along the lines of the Alfa Romeo Stelvio Quadrifoglio because this is heavier. This is right around 4,700 pounds as we're testing it right here. Although I will say that that is a decent amount lighter than some of the other large SUVs that FCA makes. So that's another way that you can tell that this wasn't exactly a direct copy of some of those other FCA SUVs just with a Maserati logo on it. This also doesn't really drive like any of their other vehicles. This has a much tighter, much different driving personality to it. In that respect, I would say this is actually a little bit more like the Alfa Romeo Stelvio because it has a very similar sense of urgency to that Alfa. Now, unfortunately, the transmission does not seem to shift quite as quickly as what we see in the Quadrifoglio, even though it is actually about the same automatic transmission. They're both ZF 8-speed automatics, and all of their power handling characteristics differ a little bit. It's basically the same 8-speed auto. The software in this Maserati is tuned to just be a little bit more relaxed than we find in the Alfa, and they tell us that that was deliberate. They see this vehicle as approaching a different customer, someone that's more interested in luxury. That's also obvious when you see how this vehicle rides. It has a much more supple ride than the Alfa Romeo Quadrifoglio, even though power levels are actually on the similar side. This is also a little bit slower 0 to 60 than the Alfa. The Alfa will actually do 0 to 60 around 3.4 seconds or so, as long as you brake torque it just a little bit. Now, if you're interested in a sportier ride, we can engage Sport mode, which will also engage the Sport suspension, and things definitely firm up, but they're never going to be quite as firm as that Alfa Romeo. We do have a quite nice exhaust note back there, but this doesn't have the same kind of bark that we find in that Alfa either. It definitely has a loud Ferrari V8 sound, however, when you really step on the throttle. Because of the luxury mission of the Levante, that exhaust note is definitely muted inside the cabin, but if you're standing outside, no one is going to question that something wicked this way is coming. We haven't been able to do our usual cabin noise tests, but I'm going to estimate that this is going to be right around the 70 decibel mark. We do have a slightly quieter cabin than we find in the Alfa Romeo Stelvio. I would actually say this is pretty comparable overall to the Porsche Cayenne and the Mercedes-Benz GLE, depending on the version of the GLE you get. Most of the noise we get in this cabin is tire noise, and that's very logical because this does have wide tires on it, as you'd expect out of a performance SUV. The all-wheel drive system in the Levante was designed not just to improve traction in adverse weather situations, but also to improve performance. And as a result of that performance mission, under most circumstances, this vehicle will be sending almost all of the power to the rear axle. Even under hard acceleration, it chooses to only send about 15 to 20% of the power up front unless there is wheel slip in the rear. That's a little bit different than some of the competition, even some of the internal competition from FCA that will be a little bit more aggressive at sending power to the front axle on hard acceleration to try and help stabilize the vehicle. Maserati decided that they wanted the feeling of a livelier rear axle, and depending on exactly what you're doing, you can definitely get the rear end to swing out a little bit more than some of those other sporty SUVs and crossovers out there. Overall, I have to say that I like the Levante an awful lot more than I thought I would initially. I wasn't too sure how I would feel about this after having driven the Quattroporte, and the suspension is tuned very, very differently in this vehicle. I really like the suspension tune in here. The damping and the spring rates appear to be a very good balance, which I don't find in the Quattroporte. And although this is definitely an SUV, and we definitely get lean in the corners, especially if you prod on it, overall, it's exactly what you'd expect out of a performance SUV. It's very, very well put together, and we have that excellent exhaust note from the back. The only major complaints I have about the Levante really circle around the paddle shifters on the steering wheel. They just don't react as quickly as I would like. Especially when we're in the manual mode and in sport mode, I would have expected the shifts to be a little bit faster. And unlike some of BMW's models, if you floor the vehicle and you're in manual mode and you flick the down paddle, you only skip down one gear. You have to crank off those shifts if you want to go all the way down to second yourself. That's a shortcut that I really appreciate in the BMW models, because if you want to pass a car up front, you don't want to wait for the paddle shifters to give you gear 4, and then gear 3, and then gear 2. I also have to admit that although 550 horsepower is an absolute blast to drive, I wish this had probably about 600 horsepower, and then the Trofeo model was even more powerful on top of that. The main reason is that we see this kind of power level from less expensive crossovers out there, and we see better performance from something like the Alfa Romeo Quadrifoglio. Obviously, they don't have the same kind of luxury trappings that we find in this vehicle. They're not quite as refined. They don't have that twin-turbo Ferrari V8 under the hood, but they will get you 0 to 60 faster than this. And I think that is just a little bit of a disappointment for the Maserati. But I still have to say that I love the way that this vehicle drives overall. Maserati has been pretty upfront that they're chasing Porsche with their latest vehicles. That will include not just this all-new Levante, but also the rest of their lineup once it gets redesigned or refreshed. That's why pricing on this is more Porsche than Mercedes. The base price is just under $76,000, and that will get you that base 3-liter V6 engine. If you want the 424 horsepower version of that engine, then you'll have to pay $86,980. The GTS that we've been driving today, the first V8 trim, starts at $119,980,000. That gives you 550 horsepower. If you want the Trofeo trim, which will give you 590 horsepower and a slightly louder bark out back, then that will set you back $169,980. This is definitely the kind of price range that we expect from Porsche. That obviously begs the question, can the Levante hang with the Porsche? Well, it depends on what you're looking for. I would say in terms of interior trappings, we definitely have very similar interiors to the Porsche. The attention to detail going on here is extreme. Even the sides of these door panels that you never see are stitched leather. The interior is very, very well done in the Levante. I really like the way that it looks, the way that it smells, the way that it feels. It feels like an ultra high-end luxury car. But the Levante doesn't handle like the Porsche Cayenne. If you want that level of handling ability, you won't find it in this particular vehicle. This is a little bit bigger, it's a little bit heavier. We don't have the same sort of detail going on when it comes to the overall suspension design. Instead, the Levante went in a kind of a different direction because we have a full adaptive air suspension with a great deal of lift in this vehicle, so this is likely going to be the more off-road capable, more off-road adventurous vehicle if that's something that you're interested in rather than on-road performance. That was made possible, of course, because Maserati is part of FCA, or Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and that entire portfolio of companies has a wide range of off-road systems. So they were able to borrow some of the componentry that we see in the Jeep Grand Cherokee and redesign it for use in this high-end luxury vehicle. And that includes the adaptive air suspension system and the way that some of the drivetrain components function. Now, in case you're wondering, this isn't a luxury Grand Cherokee. Some have said it's the nicest Grand Cherokee you'll ever drive. I've even joked that a little bit in the past. But this really isn't a Grand Cherokee with Maserati clothing on it. There are really no dimensions that are shared with the Grand Cherokee. The wheelbase is different, the length is different, the height of the vehicle is different. Absolutely no sheet metal or glass is shared. And no interior components are actually shared with the Grand Cherokee either. Instead, this borrows a few of those off-road components that were then redesigned for specific use in this vehicle, again, not directly cross-linked to the Grand Cherokee, and then it borrows a lot from the other Maserati vehicles. Most car companies out there share platforms or share design components, and that's actually a good thing, because why bother designing a different crash structure when you have one that works just fine already? So there are obvious similarities in terms of the overall design of certain components under the skin of this vehicle between this, other Maserati models, and other vehicles that FCA produces, but that doesn't really mean that this is just a Grand Cherokee with a trident on the front. With that out of the way, let's attack the most important question, which would be, should you buy one of these or should you buy a Porsche Cayenne? I would say if you're looking for something a little bit different, then definitely put the Maserati Levante on your shopping list. Not only does Maserati Levante sound fun to say, but I also think this is just a gorgeous looking vehicle. And although the Cayenne is luxurious on the inside, has a great interior, I've actually never thought it was a terribly pretty vehicle overall. And that's not something that I have to say about the Levante. I really like the way this front end looks. I really like that large trident in the front. And the interior is very, very well done. The overall driving ability of the vehicle is also excellent. It's just not quite at the same level of that Porsche. If you're looking for the best acceleration in your next luxury crossover, then the Levante may not be the vehicle for you either, because even though we have that excellent Ferrari engine under the hood, this is not going to be as fast as something like an X5M or an X6M. And there are a number of other SUVs out there that will go 0 to 60 faster than this, including something like a Grand Cherokee Trackhawk, also from FCA. That's because this was more than just giving you acceleration. This is about that exhaust note, about the interior, the entire luxury experience. And I have to say, if my money were on the line, I probably would get one of these instead of the Porsche Cayenne, but it would be a pretty close call. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. What would you get if you were shopping in this about $130,000 price range? Also, would you consider something like a Mercedes GLE AMG? Let me know down there. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. And if you want to support this channel, click up to the top of your screen. You'll be taken over to patreon.com and you can support us over there. I'll see you next week.